Behind the shining image of the world's superpower lies a dark truth. 10 crimes of the United States that history doesn't want you to remember. Crime 1. The massacre of Native Americans. Imagine a land of endless forests, rivers flowing like silver, and skies so wide they seemed eternal. For thousands of years, Native American tribes thrived here. They hunted, farmed, told stories by firelight, and lived in balance with nature. But in the 15th and 16th centuries, ships arrived from across the ocean. At first, the newcomers were strangers. Soon, they became invaders. And eventually, they brought death. When the European settlers expanded across what would later be called the United States, they didn't see Native Americans as human equals. Instead, they saw them as obstacles, barriers standing in the way of land, gold, and power. The settlers wanted territory, and they believed it was their God-given right to take it. This belief would later be called manifest destiny, the idea that America was destined to expand from coast to coast. But for Native people, this destiny meant destruction. Entire villages were burned to the ground. Families were slaughtered. Some were killed with bullets. Others with disease brought unknowingly by the settlers. Smallpox alone wiped out millions. In some places, blankets infected with disease were deliberately handed to tribes, a calculated act of biological warfare. Native Americans didn't just face battles with guns. They faced a silent war of infection that left no survivors. One of the darkest examples came with the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. The U.S. government forced over 60,000 Native Americans from their homelands in the Southeast and marched them westward. Men, women, and children were driven across hundreds of miles, often barefoot, through rain, snow, and hunger. Thousands died on the journey. Those who survived found themselves in unfamiliar lands, stripped of their culture, their homes, and their dignity. The violence was not random, it was systematic. There were official policies to remove Native Americans, to confine them to reservations, and even to kill the Indian, save the man. Children were stolen from their families and placed in boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their language or practice their traditions. Imagine being a child, punished simply for saying your own name in your mother tongue. This was not education, it was cultural erasure. By the late 19th century, massacres became infamous. At Wounded Knee in 1890, U.S. soldiers opened fire on hundreds of Lakota Sioux. Men, women, and children lay dead in the snow. The survivors were left with nothing but grief and a shattered spirit. Yet, shockingly, some of the soldiers who took part were awarded medals of honor. For the U.S. government, this was victory. For the Native people, it was genocide. And yet, the story doesn't end with silence. Despite centuries of brutality, Native Americans are still here. Their languages, once forbidden, are being taught again. Their traditions, once suppressed, are celebrated, but the scars remain. Imagine looking at the land your ancestors once walked freely, only to see it paved over by cities, highways, and pipelines. Imagine being told your history doesn't matter, when in fact, it was stolen from you. The massacre of Native Americans is not just a crime of the past, it's a wound that still bleeds. It reminds us that the United States, before becoming a superpower, built its foundation on bloodshed and dispossession. Behind every shining skyscraper and every monument of freedom lies the shadow of broken treaties, stolen land, and silenced voices. And so, when we speak of America's crimes, this is where the story begins, with the first people of the land, betrayed and destroyed in the name of progress. Their tragedy was not an accident. It was the price America was willing to pay for its empire. Crime 2. The slavery of African people. Picture this: a dark, cramped ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The stench of sweat, blood, and despair fills the air. Hundreds of men, women, and even children are chained together, lying in their own filth. Some cry out for mercy. Others no longer have the strength to cry. This was the beginning of slavery in America, the Middle Passage, a journey so brutal that many never survived it. For those who did, the nightmare was only just beginning. From the 1600s to the 1800s, millions of Africans were stolen from their homelands. They were sold like cattle, loaded onto ships, and sent to the New World to work as slaves. In the eyes of their captors, they were not human beings. They were property, tools, machines for profit, and America's wealth was built on their suffering. On the plantations of the South, enslaved Africans toiled under the burning sun. They picked cotton, harvested tobacco, and cut sugarcane until their bodies broke down. Whips tore into their backs. Shackles cut into their wrists. Families were torn apart, mothers separated from children, husbands sold away from wives. Imagine being a child, watching your parents taken away forever, powerless to stop it. For the enslaved, life was a prison with no escape. The brutality was beyond comprehension. Slave owners had absolute control. They could beat, starve, or kill their slaves without punishment. Women were often abused, forced into sexual exploitation with no chance of protection. Children were born into slavery, inheriting chains before they could even walk. Generations lived and died knowing nothing but oppression. But slavery wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Laws were written to strip enslaved people of their humanity. They were forbidden from learning to read or write. Because knowledge meant power, they were told they were inferior, less than human, destined to serve. It wasn't only about profit, it was about domination. A system designed to break the body and crush the spirit. And yet, the spirit refused to die. Songs of sorrow and hope echoed through the fields, spirituals that carried hidden messages of resistance. Some enslaved people risked everything to escape through the Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses that led them north to freedom. Figures like Harriet Tubman became legends, guiding dozens to safety despite the dangers. Others revolted, fighting against their oppressors even when the odds were impossible. Their courage proved one truth: you can chain a body, but you can never chain the human will to be free. By the mid-19th century, slavery had become the heart of America's greatest conflict, the Civil War. The North fought to preserve the Union, while the South fought to keep slavery alive. When the war ended in 1865, the 13th Amendment finally abolished slavery. But freedom came with a bitter truth. Centuries of trauma could not be erased with the stroke of a pen. The scars of slavery lived on, in poverty, discrimination, and systemic racism that continues to this very day. Think about it. The wealth of America, the railroads, the plantations, the booming economy, was built on stolen labor. Generations of Africans were robbed not only of their freedom but of their futures. And even after slavery ended, oppression simply took new forms: segregation, Jim Crow laws, lynchings, and mass incarceration. Slavery may have been abolished, but its shadow still looms large. So when we speak of America's crimes, the story of slavery is unavoidable. It is not a side note, it is the foundation. Behind every tale of freedom and democracy lies a contradiction: a nation that preached liberty while keeping millions in chains. A land that declared, "All men are created equal," while treating human beings as property. This crime was not just a mistake of history, it was an atrocity that shaped the very soul of America. And its consequences are still with us, whispering through time, reminding us that the promise of equality has yet to be fulfilled. Crime 3: The atomic bombings of Japan. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima woke to a quiet morning. Children headed to school, families prepared breakfast. Then, at 8:15 a.m., a U.S. bomber released a weapon the world had never seen. A blinding flash tore through the sky. In seconds, the city was gone. Tens of thousands of civilians were incinerated. Their shadows burned into walls. Survivors wandered through fire and rubble, their skin peeling, begging for water. 3 days later, Nagasaki met the same fate. Another bomb, another city erased. Mothers, children, workers, all obliterated. Those who lived faced something worse: radiation sickness, cancers, and birth defects that would haunt generations. The United States claimed the bombings were necessary to end World War II quickly and save American lives. Yet historians argue Japan was already collapsing, ready to surrender. Was this truly about ending war? Or was it a warning to the world, especially the Soviet Union, about America's power? The truth remains: these bombs targeted civilians, not armies. Over 200,000 lives were lost in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was not just war, it was terror, unleashed to prove dominance. The survivors, the Hibakusha, carried scars for life, burned bodies, broken families, and trauma beyond words. And humanity entered a new age, the nuclear age. From that day, the entire world has lived under the shadow of total destruction. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not only Japanese tragedies, they are global warnings. Proof that one nation's choice can scar humanity forever. Crime 4: The Vietnam War. The jungle was alive with fire. Napalm rained from the sky. Burning trees, villages, and people alike. Children ran screaming, their skin aflame. American helicopters thundered above, spraying bullets and Agent Orange, a chemical that poisoned the land and scarred generations to come. This was not just a war. It was devastation. From 1955 to 1975, the United States waged war in Vietnam, claiming it was to stop communism. But in reality, it became one of the bloodiest interventions in modern history. More than 3 million Vietnamese lost their lives: farmers, villagers, mothers, children. Entire landscapes were destroyed, crops withered, rivers were poisoned, and forests turned into barren wastelands. Agent Orange left behind an invisible curse. Babies were born with deformities. Illnesses passed from one generation to the next. Even today, families in Vietnam suffer from cancers, disabilities, and land contaminated by unexploded bombs. The war did not end when the guns fell silent, it continues in the bodies of those affected. And for what? The U.S. poured billions into the conflict, sent 500,000 soldiers, and sacrificed over 58,000 American lives. Yet in the end, they lost. The world watched the fall of Saigon in 1975. Helicopters evacuating the last Americans as chaos consumed the city. A war fought in the name of freedom ended in humiliation, leaving behind a legacy of pain. The Vietnam War remains one of America's greatest crimes, not only because of the lives it destroyed, but because it was unnecessary. It was a war driven by fear, pride, and politics, not by justice. And its victims, both in Vietnam and America, still carry the scars. The Iraq War, 2003. March 2003. The world watched in shock as American missiles lit up the skies over Baghdad. The United States claimed Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, a threat too dangerous to ignore. But when the dust settled, no such weapons were ever found. The war had begun on a lie. What followed was chaos. Iraq, a nation already weakened by years of sanctions, descended into bloodshed. Cities were reduced to rubble. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded. Markets, schools, and mosques, places of everyday life, were turned into battlegrounds. Over 1 million Iraqis were killed. Millions more fled their homes, becoming refugees with no place to return. The U.S. toppled Saddam Hussein, but instead of bringing stability, they opened the door to an even darker future. Sectarian violence exploded. Extremist groups, once weak, grew powerful in the chaos. Out of this destruction rose ISIS, a monster born from the ashes of war. For American soldiers, too, the cost was enormous. Over 4,000 never returned home. Tens of thousands came back wounded, carrying both visible scars and invisible trauma. The war drained trillions of dollars, money taken from taxpayers and poured into destruction. And what was gained? No weapons of mass destruction. No victory that justified the cost. Instead, Iraq became a shattered nation, scarred by war and foreign occupation. Ordinary people, families, children, the elderly, paid the highest price. The Iraq War stands as one of America's greatest crimes, a war built on deception, driven by oil and power, not justice. It left behind not freedom, but ruins, and its consequences still echo today, proving that the truth is often the first casualty of war. Crime 6. Human experimentation, Tuskegee and beyond. Imagine being sick, going to the doctor, and trusting that you'll be treated, only to find out years later that you were never meant to be healed at all. This was the dark reality of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, one of the most shameful episodes in American medical history. From 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service secretly studied 600 African American men in Alabama, most of them poor sharecroppers. Nearly 400 had syphilis. They were told they were receiving free medical care. In truth, they were deliberately denied treatment, even after penicillin was discovered as a cure in the 1940s. Doctors watched as the men suffered, went blind, insane, or died. Wives were infected. Children were born sick, all in the name of science. Tuskegee was not an isolated case. Throughout the 20th century, the U.S. government and military conducted disturbing experiments on unsuspecting people. In Guatemala, prisoners and patients were deliberately infected with syphilis and gonorrhea without their consent. During the Cold War, soldiers and civilians were exposed to radiation tests. In prisons, inmates were injected with chemicals to study their effects. Again and again, the vulnerable were used as lab rats. The excuse was always research. The truth was exploitation. Trust was betrayed. Lives were destroyed. And in many cases, no justice was ever delivered. These experiments reveal a chilling reality, even in a nation that claims to uphold freedom and human rights. Its own citizens were sacrificed for secret agendas. The victims of Tuskegee and other tests were not statistics, they were fathers, mothers, children. Their suffering is a reminder that when power and science lack morality, humanity itself becomes the experiment. Crime 7. Overthrowing foreign governments. When America speaks of democracy, it often presents itself as the defender of freedom. But behind closed doors, the U.S. has toppled governments around the world, not to protect democracy, but to protect its own interests. Take Iran, 1953. The elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, wanted to nationalize Iran's oil so the profits would benefit his people. For the US and Britain, this was unacceptable. The CIA launched Operation Ajax, spreading propaganda, bribing officials, and stirring chaos until Mossadegh was overthrown. In his place, America restored the Shah, a dictator loyal to Western oil companies. Iranians paid the price with decades of repression, leading to the revolution of 1979. Or Chile, 1973. President Salvador Allende, a socialist, was democratically elected, but his policies threatened U.S. business interests. The CIA funded strikes, armed opposition, and destabilized the economy. Eventually, a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet seized power. Allende died, and Chile fell into 17 years of brutal dictatorship, marked by torture, disappearances, and death squads. And this pattern repeats across the globe. Guatemala, 1954. Where a reformist president was removed for daring to challenge the United Fruit Company. Congo, 1961. Where nationalist leader Patrice Lumumba was assassinated with Western complicity. Time and again, America's hand moved silently, replacing leaders chosen by their people with regimes that served U.S. corporations and Cold War strategies. The result? Broken nations, lost lives, stolen futures. The rhetoric of freedom masked an empire's cold calculation. America's interventions were not about spreading democracy, they were about controlling it. And the cost was always paid in blood. Not in Washington, but in the streets of Tehran, Santiago, and countless other cities where people cried for freedom and received dictatorship instead. Crime 8. The 2008 global financial crisis. It all began with a dream, the American home. Banks promised that anyone could own one, no matter their income. Mortgages were handed out like candy, bundled into complex financial products that Wall Street sold for billions. On the surface, it looked like prosperity. In reality, it was a ticking time bomb. By 2008, the bubble burst. Housing prices collapsed. Millions of families who thought they had achieved the American dreams suddenly found themselves drowning in debt. Homes were seized, lives uprooted, streets across America filled with foreclosure signs. Families slept in cars. Children asked why they had no place to call home. But the damage didn't stop at U.S. borders. Because Wall Street's toxic products were sold worldwide, the entire global economy collapsed. Stock markets plunged. Businesses shut down. Jobs vanished overnight. In some countries, unemployment soared to levels not seen since the Great Depression. What began in America became a crisis for the world. And yet, who paid the price? Ordinary people. Workers, families, the poor. Meanwhile, the very banks that caused the disaster were rescued with government bailouts. Executives walked away with bonuses. While millions lost everything, justice was promised, but accountability never came. The 2008 crisis was not an accident, it was the product of greed, deregulation, and corruption at the heart of America's financial system. A system where profit mattered more than people. For many, it was a brutal lesson. America's economic power can build dreams. But it can also destroy them, and drag the entire world down with it. The scars of 2008 remain. Proof that when Wall Street gambles, humanity pays. Crime 9. Guantanamo Bay Prison. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the United States declared a new kind of war, the War on Terror. In its shadow, a prison was born, far from American soil. Hidden on the island of Cuba. Its name became infamous, Guantanamo Bay. Here, men from across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia were flown in, accused of terrorism, but often without evidence. Some were captured on the battlefield. Others were sold for bounty money. Many had no trial, no lawyer, no chance to defend themselves. They were locked away in cages. Indefinitely. What happened inside those walls shocked the world. Prisoners were subjected to enhanced interrogation, a phrase that tried to mask the truth. In reality, it was torture, sleep deprivation, waterboarding, shackling men in painful positions for hours. Psychological torment that broke the human mind. Images leaked of men in orange jumpsuits, hooded, kneeling on the ground under armed guard. The world saw, and many recoiled. The U.S. government justified it as necessary to keep the world safe. But the question remained: safe for whom? Innocent men were imprisoned for years. Some released later without charges. Their lives forever shattered. Families never saw their sons again. Justice, for them, was stolen. Even today, Guantanamo stands as a symbol of American hypocrisy, preaching freedom and human rights to the world, while operating a prison outside the law. It showed how fear can erase principles, and how power can silence accountability. The truth of Guantanamo Bay is clear: it was not just a prison, but a crime against human dignity itself. And its shadow still hangs over America's image in the eyes of the world. Closing. The legacy of America's crimes. 10 crimes. 10 chapters of history that America would rather the world forget. From the massacre of Native Americans to the burning fields of Vietnam, from slavery to the prisons of Guantanamo, from Hiroshima to Iraq. Different times, different places, but one truth unites them all: when unchecked power is wielded in the name of freedom, It can become a weapon of destruction. For some, America is the land of dreams. For others, it is the source of nightmares. The smiling face of democracy hides scars left across continents. And while these stories are told in whispers in classrooms or buried in textbooks, the victims remember, the families torn apart, the cultures erased, the lands poisoned. They carry the weight of history. But this story is not only about America. It is about humanity. It is a reminder that no nation, no matter how powerful, is free from accountability. Empires rise, and empires fall. What remains are the choices they made, the lives they shaped, and the blood they spilled. So the question remains: will America face its past, or continue to hide behind its myths? The world is watching, and history never forgets. These were 10 of the darkest crimes committed by America, events that changed lives, destroyed nations, and shaped history forever. But what do you think? Do you believe America will ever take responsibility for these actions? Or are these crimes destined to be buried under the weight of propaganda and power? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together, we can keep history alive, so it is never forgotten.